say first off to say thank you to the Urban Alliance and Race Relations for inviting me to speak at your AGM today. It's a great honor, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In my tradition, we always acknowledge the ancestral lands of the peoples that were here before us as we sit here in Toronto. So I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Mississauga we credit. I also want to say congratulations. I didn't know you've been around for so long and that you're having your anniversary next year, or it's this year, and that's fabulous. It's great work that you've accomplished, and I think that the first time I met anyone from the Urban Alliance was years ago at the Police Services Board when we were fighting over strip searching. And I remember every time I went to the Police Services Board, there'd be the deputation list, and it was always Urban Alliance, Aboriginal Legal Services, and African Canadian Legal Clinic. Same, three people, same three organizations. So I know the battles that you fight, and I congratulate on the work that you've done. Now, this is a new presentation. We have a new logo and everything, so you're my, I'm testing it out actually. We'll see how it works. So, I want to talk to you about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the work that we're doing. And before I do that, I want to go back to June 11th, 2008 at 3 p.m. And on that day, Stephen Harper gave an apology, and he said, "The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly." And I remember where I was when this apology came out, and I think some people in the audience remember where they were that day. And I remember I was at my office at Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto, and the entire staff was in our room with the TV on. And you can hear a pin drop in the room while we watched the apology that Stephen Harper was giving that day. And I remember looking out the window and seeing the commotion. The commotion in the city of Toronto while this momentous occasion was happening for Aboriginal people. And thinking to myself, don't these other Canadians care? Why aren't they listening to this on CBC radio? Why aren't they watching this on CBC News? It was telecast. And that made me sad. It was a significant moment, and it brings tears to my eyes today when I think about that moment. And I think that, unfortunately, some people will say, well, what was he apologizing for? And before I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I want to talk about what he was apologizing for. Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Not just First Nations people's history, but in Canada's history. Stephen Harper called it a sad chapter. To kill the Indian in the child. For more than a century, Indian residential schools separated 150,000 Aboriginal children from their family and their homes. The federal government and the churches in Canada developed and administered the schools, and they had two primary objectives. First, it was to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures. Aboriginal children were seen as savages. They were thought of as savages, and the government and the churches thought that we needed to assimilate them into Canadian society. The mission, as you'll see on that slide, was to kill the Indian in the child. It was thought that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal to the rest of Canadians. So we are sorry. These are quotes from Prime Minister Harper on June 11th. He said, "We recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. Not only did you suffer," he's speaking to Aboriginal people, these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience, and for this we are sorry. What was the abuse that he was speaking about? There were over 130 residential schools in Canada. The last school closed in 1996, and that's shocking for many Canadians to know that. Today, we estimate that there are over 80,000 living survivors of the residential school system. So, while some of them had positive experiences, and I know a few, I've spoken to a few, many suffered emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. All the students suffered isolation, loss of culture, and loss of language. Many of the children were forced to do manual labor. Many were provided moldy, maggot-infested food. There was overcrowding, illnesses, serious illnesses such as TB. Children were forced to sleep outside in the wintertime. They were forced to wear their soiled underwear on their heads. Students report that they were used for medical experimentation. There was disease and there was death. What has been the impact of the residential school system? Last school closing in 1996. The long-term social and psychological impacts of the Indian residential school system are evident today because we look at the disproportionate rate of suicide in our community. We look at the disproportionate rate of addiction, violence, school dropout rates, poverty, and unemployment. And it didn't stop just with the survivors. Along with the direct impacts of this to the students themselves, there have been intergenerational impacts as a result of the school system. And that's because of the lack of parenting skills and the loss of traditional knowledge and skills that would have been handed down if they hadn't been removed from their communities. There has been a repetitive cycle of physical and sexual abuse in the community. So how has Canada and the government and the churches attempted to address this legacy of the Indian residential school system? There have been a couple steps that the government has taken over the years. The first was in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. They called that there be a public investigation into the violence and the abuses of residential school. That investigation never occurred. In 1998, Canada formally responded to the RCAP report with Gathering Strength, Canada's Aboriginal Action Plan. It included a statement of reconciliation and $350 million to establish the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. The statement of reconciliation in the Aboriginal community wasn't seen as a proper apology from the government. And many of you may have read the Aboriginal Healing Foundation is actually slated to be closed and the funding is stopped being flowed to them starting this year. The churches have taken steps to address the legacy. Since 1986, churches have offered various statements of regret, sorrow, or apology. The most recent statement coming from the Pope in April of 2009. And listed on the slide are the other years and dates of the various churches that were involved in Indian residential schools and their efforts at making apology and amends with the Aboriginal community. While the churches and the government were attempting to address the legacy through apologies, there was a class action. And nothing like the lawsuit to get people to listen. So while this was going, a class action of survivors from across Canada was making its way through the court system. This class action resulted in the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. The settlement agreement was approved by all the parties in May 2006, and implementation began in September 2007. Part of the class action settlement, it was a big settlement, and the settlement agreement is actually on the internet and is attached to the Truth and Reconciliation website and can be found in a number of locations. But the settlement had a number of components. It included a common experience payment which was paid to all former students of the residential school system. There was implemented an independent assessment payment, which was paid or processed, which is a process for individuals that were subjected to physical, that's fine, physical or sexual abuse. Survivors can apply for that compensation, and it is a hearing process that they go through, so it's a validation process, where the CEP, the Common Experience Payment, is an automatic payment if you attended any of the schools. The settlement also created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I'm going to shortly be speaking about. In addition, the settlement had contained commemoration initiatives, and it also had measures for supporting healing in the Aboriginal community.